Welcome everyone to the May Alive Academy. I am so pleased that you could all join us today for this webinar focusing on understanding the challenges volunteers administrators face results from a recent research study. And we have with us today David Thorne, who will be presenting. Alive is very pleased to host this session, which explores a recent study on volunteer administrators in the United States and showcases the differences and similarities across volunteer administration groups. Participants will learn the top challenges facing volunteer administrators along with common management practices. This session is 60 minutes long today. If you can't stay for the whole hour and you're a member, you can go ahead and log into Alive's website and catch the replay later. But of course, I hope you all will consider staying for the entire duration of today's session. My name is Darlene Laird. I am the Skilled Volunteer Strategy and Engagement Manager at Habitat for Humanity International, and I will be your host today for the session. And I'm joined with Gretchen Jordan, who's our Association Manager and Producer for today. Just a quick overview of our agenda. We'll deal with some housekeeping notifications pretty quickly. Then we'll go into introductions. And of course, we're all here for the presentation. We'll have time for questions and discussion after David speaks. And finally, I encourage you to stay tuned at the end of the webinar to learn more about upcoming Alive Academy sessions. If you are having trouble with audio or visual during today's session, sorry, that is my assistant, you've got options. You can keep us streaming in the video on your computer, but call in from your phone with audio only. If you're having trouble with your bandwidth, sometimes calling in by phone will help. Put any other technical questions that you might have in the chat box, and Gretchen will help to sort you out. Speaking of the chat box, if you want to talk to all attendees, make sure you choose that function first. Otherwise, you'll just be talking to Gretchen and myself, and we want to encourage you to chat with one another and share your experiences. So we'll be monitoring questions as we go along, so don't forget to drop them in the chat box as well. I could not be more pleased to introduce David Thorne. David currently lives in Cleveland, Ohio with his wife and 3 boys. Most nights you can find him on a soccer field coaching. He developed a passion for effective volunteer management while helping start 2 growing churches in his cities. This church worked closely with local schools, police, government, and other nonprofits to address community concerns. He holds a master in practical theology, counseling, management, and leadership, and has recently earned a doctorate in leadership studies. His research focuses on effective volunteer leadership. David presently works at Missional Marketing, helping churches and nonprofits grow their online presence. Welcome, David, and now we'll turn it over to you and we'll get started with the presentation.
Cool, thanks so much, Darlene. I'll get this sharing here, and yeah, definitely feel free to chat along as you guys have any thoughts, feedback, questions, and Darlene and Gretchen will be monitoring that, and we'll pipe in case there's something we need to pause and chat about, or otherwise they'll bring some of those thoughts up at the end. So yeah, I am in Cleveland right now. It is raining, so I could go outside and I think swim in my front yard. Because it is raining a lot. I don't think it's ever going to rain. I mentioned to Darlene and Gretchen, I think I'm going to go outside and start building an ark because it may never stop raining. So that's where I am right now in Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm so glad to share with you guys. I finished a study and I'm very excited to share with you guys the results. It's one of those things every once in a while. As a volunteer administrator, you're kind of curious, what is the research saying? What is it that we're finding out, and how can that apply to what we do as volunteer administrators? So I finished a study and I'm excited to share with you what I found. I hope it's helpful. So my study was called Investigating Differences in Volunteer Administrator Challenges and Management Practices. And it's built around a question. And the question is this: it's how do groups utilizing volunteers differ? You know, when you think about individuals overseeing, say, an animal shelter, overseeing volunteer firefighters, or soccer coaches, or all the various places that volunteers are led, are the challenges that they face exactly the same, or are they different? Are the management practices that they use or should use, are they the same or are they different? And do those differences matter? And how do those differences impact how we should lead our volunteers? That's some of the questions that led me to this study. Now, specifically, I am looking at examining the differences across groups utilizing volunteers. And as I mentioned, I specifically looked at challenges that volunteer administrators face and the application of common management practices. Here we go. So what I did is I explored the top challenges. My goal was also to find out what challenges are universal and what is specific. And I wanted to discover what are the most applied management practices and just kind of figure out how context matters. Now, in order to do this, I looked at groups based on their NTEE, or National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities, say that 10 times fast, core codes. So here you can see these are the I guess 9 most common core codes. And what I actually want to do is I want you to think about which core code best represents your organization. And in order to do that, I also want to kind of get a feel for who's in the room right now. So I think that Gretchen can actually put up here a poll, and I would like you to go ahead and answer which group most defines your organization.
Getting a lot of great feedback, and then a little bit of everything here. 75% of people have participated in the poll, so I'm going to give you another 15, 20 seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
See what we got in our group here. That's the fun part about this kind of stuff also is also just listening to each other, seeing who else is around and what's going on with each other, which I love that. So looks like we have 33% human services, followed by health, and those individuals working with animals at 13%. And cool, we have a few not listed. So I know sometimes the not listed ones, you're probably saying, you know, it's complex. There's a few things you do, like if a YMCA, some of that kind of stuff. You're like, I don't know which group I fit in. So if that's you, I totally get it. That's a common thing. So cool, very, very cool. All right, you can close that, Gretchen. Thanks for that. So it just gives us an idea of who's in the room. And that's where we, part of this is looking at these specific groups. And you can kind of think about your group and think through what is specific about your group and your type of volunteers that you guys use in that group. All right. So this just shows you what I came up with in my study. Is we had 460 responses that actually represented 45 different states, which is very cool. A lot from Ohio, California, and Pennsylvania. You can see I had a lot from in health, a lot in human services, which we do too in here in this group. And that just shows you the different ones that are there. Big picture, if you were wondering, the answer is yes. The group that individuals were part of, the volunteer administrators were part of, did impact the challenges faced and the management practices. So there were differences that those who oversaw and led volunteers, there were differences across groups. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about and kind of look through what is different and what is universal, what is similar across all groups, and see what we can learn. All right, we're going to start with challenges and looking at the common challenges that volunteer administrators face. And here is the list that we used in the study that just kind of looks at, here are the most common challenges that volunteer administrators face. So look at that a second. You can kind of see that there's a few related to recruiting enough volunteers, recruiting those with the right skills, those during the workday, challenge of lack of funds, lack of paid staff time to train, regulatory constraints, having more volunteers than organizations can accommodate, which I know some people may laugh at that and say, I wish I had that problem. Resistance on the part of paid staff, absenteeism are kind of related to the quality of the volunteers that are helping, and volunteers not continuing. I want to mention that I added this last one, partially because I was intrigued to find out, was volunteers not continuing, so quitting, was a volunteer a kind of unplanned turnover? Where does that kind of challenge fit into the challenges that volunteer administrators face? So we added that in there just to kind of see where that fit. Now, what I want to do next is I actually have another poll, because what I want you to do is, before I show you overall what were the top challenges faced by those in my study, I want to again look at our group and figure out what are the two biggest challenges that volunteer administrators face in our group. So if you can go ahead and fill out this poll, and let's find out what are the top two greatest challenges faced by this group in this room right now.
All right, everybody is voting again. And oh, we're getting a little bit of everything, which is good.
Gretchen gets the fun, you get to see everything come in. I wish we get, I'm jealous. It's always fun to see that too.
Yeah, that would be kind of a cool thing if Zoom could do that. Maybe there'd be a way to like show or hide, just in case you were asking something and everybody said either yes or no, and maybe you didn't want to see that. Okay, we're at 66% have participated. I'm going to wait just another moment here, and then I will close the poll.
I know this can take another minute because you have to partially read the options and then think about yourself. Some people are saying, well, all of those are issues, and so that's why they're on the list, is because they're some of the most common challenges that volunteer administrators face.
Absolutely. And I certainly, we're almost there. I would expect many people are like, well, can I pick more than two? But
right.
Top two.
I'll give us the most interesting information.
All right, I will go ahead and close the poll.
All right. And this is, all right, so looks like 32% said recruiting enough volunteers is the top challenge, followed closely by recruiting volunteers available during the workday, followed by resistance on the part of paid staff or board members, and then fourth, lack of funds to support volunteer administration. So having enough volunteers, like the type of volunteers who can work during the day, some internal resistance probably to the volunteer presence and use, and then lack of funds to support, probably closely related to internal resistance. If there's internal resistance, there may not be money to follow it. Cool, that's awesome. That's very, very insightful.
Hey, David, just a quick question we have in the chat box. Was this study conducted before or during COVID? Or
Yeah,
after?
right after COVID. So after COVID.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. All right, so we can close this. All right, so now we have this. Let's look at what were what were kind of the results of what the people who were studied, what was their findings. Here were the top challenges overall, is recruiting volunteers available during the workday. So that was actually one of ours as well. This was the top one of the group that was studied, followed by recruiting volunteers with the right skills or expertise, followed by recruiting a sufficient number of volunteers. So the three recruiting ones were the top three, lack of paid staff time, and then volunteers not continuing. So those were the top kind of four there, which, we had a lot of similarities as well, especially recruiting volunteers during the workday. That was the top one for the group. What I want to do now is I want to look at each individual group and kind of, because when I looked at the study, what was so interesting to me is I feel like each group and the challenges they faced kind of told a story. When you look at their top challenges and least challenges, along with the research for each of those groups, a story for each group begins to reveal itself. And so I kind of want to just take a moment, a quick minute for each, and just kind of share what is the story that's being told for each group. So we'll start with animals. Their top challenges, individuals who oversee animals, their top challenges are recruiting volunteers to work during the day, volunteers not continuing, no time to train, and too many volunteers. So this begins to tell the story of, those who work with animals. There's a whole lot of volunteers, but not a lot of time to train them. And there's a challenge of those volunteers not continuing. So those volunteers are quitting, and just the struggle to find volunteers who are able to work at specific times. You can just kind of see that challenge begins to tell a story. I'm looking at the research of just what do we notice in the research is the challenges revolved around a lot of role ambiguity of just, what are different individuals allowed or not allowed to do, and volunteers disregarding rules, paid staff struggling to enforce different rules and that kind of stuff. And just as a very quick eye blink response, I'm going to give just an eye blink response to each of what the research is saying, is just maybe an encouragement to increase decision-making input from volunteers for those in this group, and just the encouragement to try to find ways to decrease role ambiguity. That's just just quick eye blink response, kind of responding to the challenges in this specific group. Going on to those in arts, culture, and humanity, we see poor work habits. So that's related to the type of work that volunteers are offering, along with too many volunteers and no time to train those volunteers. Something that was very interesting about those who work in arts, culture, and humanity or oversee volunteers in that group is research focused less on recruitment type issues, and we're more struggling with how do I deal with very devoted, passionate volunteers and the challenges of overseeing, managing, and leading a very passionate, devoted volunteer base, along with a fear of losing those volunteers. If I have this very passionate, devoted volunteer who knows a lot and cares a lot about this subject, the fear of losing that quality volunteer. A quick eye blink response is just the value of creating a healthy volunteer culture is very, very important in order to maintain a healthy volunteer base. And so just a reminder that there are other fish in the sea, knowing that there are other enthusiasts and passionate people out there And so to just an encouragement to not let fear overshadow what you know to be good leadership. Moving on to those in environment. Now, what's interesting about environment is out of all the groups, they had one of the lowest concern for recruiting enough volunteers. By far, they were significantly lower of their concern for recruiting enough volunteers, and just, poor work habits. So just this group really told the story of, it wasn't a matter of, they were not concerned with getting enough volunteers or even what their volunteers were doing. It was more just the challenge of how do we train volunteers we have and find the kind of volunteers that know about the stuff that we do. These programs tended to rely a lot on volunteers. And again, just their greatest challenge was finding enough time to train the volunteers they had. So really, I think the encouragement for those in this group is making sure that there is enough time dedicated to train volunteers in what they're doing, and just make sure that there's an emphasis on that. But the biggest, it was just so interesting that those who oversee volunteers on environment, that recruiting enough volunteers was just such a low concern for them. That was just very, very intriguing. All right, moving on to those in health, which we have a lot of those here in this room. This was pretty straight down the line of just recruiting. There was a big challenge for recruiting, no time to train, and volunteers quitting. So just all of their top challenges had to do with their interaction with volunteers directly. Just struggle with recruiting them, training them, dealing with them, how they're working. It's a very person-to-person centered challenges. It's interesting in the research, there's a lot of concern about where do volunteers fit compared to the rest of a care team, and trying to understand the value and where a volunteer fits in the care of patient care, along with just the challenge of inflexible schedules and emotional burnout was a challenge for volunteers and for those who oversee volunteers. This group is more likely to have applied management practices than all the other groups. They were very high of applying all of the various management practices, which was interesting. The one thing as the iBlink response is just making sure that volunteers have connection with each other and finding ways to encourage emotional support for the volunteers, between volunteers, and as much as possible to help volunteers understand their place on the team when it comes to patient care. All right, a few more for the specific ones is those in human services. I think we had a good amount there. This is very similar to their top challenges related to recruiting, volunteers not continuing, and lack of funds was their fourth one. But just recruiting for those in human services was were very big challenges, followed with volunteers quitting. And this was just kind of a more standard of volunteer recruitment and retention. Just to tend to be a continued concern across groups, or across groups in human services, just trying to get and retain more people. Volunteers may be motivated to volunteer, just as a quick iBlink thought about when it comes to recruitment, by just being asked, looking for volunteers who are connected to the issue that you are relating, you're volunteering or trying to gather volunteers for, and people who are just have social connections to the people who are connected to your organization. Those are just some very quick iBlink recruitment things that those in human services can consider. Think about where are the pools that you're fishing, which there's a phrase called volunteerability, looking for people who most easily volunteered for and most easily connected to your organization. So just some quick eye blink thoughts there. Education, we can see that for those in education, it's again recruiting day volunteers, which was the highest one in our group here. Again, recruiting sufficient, recruiting skilled, and volunteer quitting. I'm sure you guys can even see there seems to be some themes even amongst these, that there are some similarities amongst the groups, even though they're kind of telling their own story. One thing here, and I saw this multiple times when it comes to like libraries. That's a specific one where when there is decreased funding, that can lead to an increased dependency on volunteers, which can then lead to tension between staff and volunteers, which when there's tension between staff and volunteers, that's clearly not going to create the ideal culture in which to create a thriving volunteer base. So just kind of partially just acknowledging that that is a thing, and acknowledging that, you know, as much as we can, we need to understand that that's not good for volunteers, and maybe that's something that some people in this group are facing when we have decreased funding, leading to an increased dependency on volunteers, while also people who are paid questioning where they fit. Another thing that is just interesting when it came to volunteer administrators is that their choice was often inadvertent. They didn't understand why they were chosen, why it didn't seem very thoughtful or planful. They felt undervalued in what they were doing. And it was just interesting that they called themselves inadvertent leaders because they didn't understand why they were even chosen at all. And just I also saw a big challenge of lack of organizational support was a challenge for those in education. Just saying as an eye blink response is an encouragement to focus on training people who do work with volunteers and understanding that as much as possible to try to solve and address the tension between those who are paid staff and those who are volunteers, and try to make sure that doesn't hurt your volunteer base and hurt your volunteer management, because that's not going to help anyone. So yeah, I thought that was one of the more interesting things I saw was some of the tension between staff and volunteers in the research. Religion related, there weren't many of those in our room. Again, recruiting, interestingly enough, those in religion related had the highest challenge in recruiting enough volunteers compared to every other group. This is the group that my background is most closely related to. And here's the big picture. Volunteers in religion related are weird. They're kind of their own thing. They apply management practices in their own way. Their challenges are their own thing. They're just kind of an interesting own thing. I just thought it was interesting that recruiting sufficient number of volunteers was by far their highest challenge and higher than every other group for the type of groups in religion related where one might think that volunteering would be a main thing that they do. I just found that very intriguing, especially when that's related to my background. Just saying that, you know, I could talk about this group a lot from my own personal experience, but those in religious organizations need to figure out the nature of that recruiting issue and figure out what it is that is a challenge that's keeping them from that major recruiting enough volunteers being a major issue. So that's something that needs to be paused and thought about, that there's not quick and easy answers to necessarily. All right, I think this is the last group, is those in public and societal benefit. So dealing with advocacy, philanthropy, that kind of stuff. The biggest challenge here in the research has to do with finding people with the right skills. and then finding and maintaining grants, all of this kind of stuff, and then burnout due to a very specific smaller number of people who know how to have these specific skills related to grants. And it's just the only I-Blink challenge is thinking through how you can partner with organizations that have a higher skilled workforce that align with grant writing and some of this other stuff. So that's kind of, those are all of the group stuff. I know that was a lot and just trying to go through, but even as we think through the story that each specific group told, I know that all of us, we can relate to all of those things, even if it is, kind of the story that the research of that specific group is telling, it's still something we can all relate to. So now kind of backing up and see, what do we notice overall when it comes to the challenges? I noticed that there's a lot of overlap when it comes to the top 2 challenges by group. And we saw this even in our group, we can kind of add into that, is the top challenges of all of the groups really had to do around recruiting enough volunteers, recruiting sufficient volunteers, recruiting skilled volunteers. And you can see here, 4 of those groups actually had all 3 recruiting as their top 3 challenges. Those in health and environment had 2, and arts, culture, and humanity was its own thing where recruiting wasn't one of its top challenges. So just saying, for those of us in this room, if recruiting is one of your greatest challenges, then you're in good company. And if it's not, then that's awesome. And then you're doing really well. And it's worth being aware of, cool, my challenges might be slightly different than other groups. And that's awesome. That's kind of saying, being aware that those in your group and those who are volunteer administrators overall, these are the common challenges that volunteer administrators face. One thing I want, when I kind of look back at the top challenges, in my mind, a story also begins to form. And I think it's worth thinking through, what is the story when we look at all of the groups together? What is the story that's being told? And you can see here, if we look at these top 5, we see that when a volunteer organization doesn't have enough time to train and supervise volunteers, well, guess what? I mean, that organization, when you don't have enough time to train and supervise volunteers, then recruiting may be an issue for you. And you may have volunteers that quit. So you don't have time to train, you don't have time to supervise. And if you're not training and supervising your volunteers, then those volunteers may quit. And when you have a lot of quitting volunteers, that's going to lead to recruiting. And so in my mind, you just see that there's a story beginning to tell. And I think that story begins with having enough time to train and supervise volunteers. If we have enough time to train and supervise, and we can retain volunteers, then we may have less volunteers quitting. And then if we have less volunteers quitting, then we're able to not have to spend as much time recruiting. So that was my most interesting observation, just kind of looking at what is the story that's being told. So I want to move to management practices. And let me just pause before I jump into management practices for Darlene and Gretchen. If there's anything that is worth just pausing and touching on before I move there. Management practice is a little shorter. We're not going to take a huge deep dive. It's going to be a lot more just quick when it comes to management practices. But before we jump in to that, is there anything specific that might be worth jumping on before I move on?
Yeah, so we had some people put some follow-up questions in the chat about when this was completed and at what point after COVID. It seemed like there are a couple people interested in knowing the exact time that this was created.
Okay, yeah. So I need to find the specific dates because And actually, I misspoke. It was right before COVID. It was like 6 months before COVID. It ended, I think, in like April, and it was right. So it was right before the world went crazy. So that's I have to get the exact dates. I don't have the dates in this presentation. So what I'll do is, Gretchen, I'll add the dates into a slide, and then when I send you the slides, the date, like the start dates of when I took the data, will be in it.
That'll be great. Thank you, David.
Yeah, and one other question that just came up in my mind, David, when you talked about the religious organizations, is it that the religious organizations were having trouble recruiting volunteers for their own purposes, or recruiting volunteers as groups to go out to serve other organizations, or both?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't, the people that were asked were just a general surveys, but it was also sent to various pastor groups and church and actual religious organizations. And those individuals, I can't say for certain, but they were probably thinking for their own purposes and not necessarily for external related volunteering. Now, but more internal related volunteering. Other just like religious type groups, like say Catholic Charities, of course, that's gonna be a different type of thing.
Great, thank you. And I didn't see any other questions related to your presentation in the chat.
Were a few
but
more
I'm sure.
that came up.
Oh, okay. Were generational demographics taken into consideration?
No, and that's a great observation. That's where, we know the common age range of volunteers, for it's around that like 50-ish age person is the most common age group. But I didn't take those. It's one of those things where I was researching volunteer administrators, not volunteers. So for my purposes, in understanding the challenges that volunteer administrators face, understanding who the volunteer administrator was, whether they were female, male, or age, wasn't as important for the challenges that they're facing. It was mostly, I wanted to see what are they facing, not necessarily who they are as a person.
Great. Well, that's now all I see in the chat box, and we can move on. And I bet you there'll be some other questions that come up.
Yeah, great. So now kind of thinking about management practices, the things that we do to manage volunteers. And here are the kind of the most common management practices we see: regularly supervising and communicating with volunteers, liability coverage, regular collection of information, screening procedures to identify suitable volunteers, written policies and job descriptions, recognition activities, award ceremonies, annual measurement, training and professional development, and training for paid staff in working with volunteers. So these are kind of the most common management practices. So similar to what we did with challenges, Gretchen has a poll for us to kind of look into what are the most common, most applied management practices for those in this group. So if you had to say, just, as again, kind of an eye blink, if you look through this list and thought, what are my highest 2 or most applied management practices, what would you say?
Folks are jumping right on this. And again, I'm thinking people would love to have more than 2 choices, but
Yep.
they're that's kind of a horse race here. Folks are voting. We're almost at 60%. almost, oh, we're at 70% now. We're waiting for, it's close. All right, I'm going to give it just about 10 more seconds and then I'll close the poll and show it. And
It's like a cliffhanger, Gretchen.
I know it. Dun, dun,
Yes.
dun, play that music.
Giving us the play-by-play. She's saying, yeah,
Here we
like
go.
a horse race of Mother of Pearl is pulling up on number 2 in the race. All right, here we go. Yeah, let's see what we got. Okay. Training for paid staff to work with volunteers is the least applied management practice, or at least it is the least chosen as the top 2. Screening procedures to identify suitable volunteers, written policy and descriptions for volunteer involvement, top 2, it looks like, followed closely by regular supervision and communication, and collection of volunteer hours. Okay, yeah, there's like a 4-horse race, it seems, of screening, policies, supervision, and collection of hours. Cool, thanks, Gretchen. And then the least there was the training for paid staff working with volunteers. Cool. All right, so let's look at what I found in the study. Top challenges are collection of, or most applied management practice, regular collection of information of hours. Second most applied, regular supervision of and communication, written policy and job descriptions, and screening. So actually, I think those were our top 4 as well, actually, which is interesting. That's kind of cool. And look at the least applied, training for paid staff to work with volunteers. So our group kind of mirrors directly what was found in my study, which is that's kind of cool. It's kind of interesting. It just shows that there are some similarities. A few key findings, again, those in religion related, they applied management practices to a lesser degree than other groups. They're kind of weird, a little different. Those in health applied recognition activities more than multiple groups. And just kind of interesting, I don't necessarily have an answer for this, but those in public and societal benefit applied liability coverage or insurance protection for volunteers to lesser degree than other groups. I don't really have an answer for that, but just a few just kind of big picture interesting things. There were a lot of similarities. So even though there were a lot of differences, there's also a lot of similarities. So when you look at like the top 2 most applied management practices, collecting volunteer hours was one of the top 2 for a lot of the groups. And you can see here, regular supervision of volunteers was a second one by a lot of groups. So that's there's some, a lot of similarities. Collecting enough volunteer hours and supervision of volunteers were 2 of the most applied management practices. When you think of just kind of like big picture observations, this is one of the things I found most interesting of almost just the entire study. And this might be one of the things I would say when you leave this discussion today, what I'm about to say might be one of the more important things you should take from this. Now, I also looked at budgets and kind of looking at, the budgets of these organizations and kind of see, not surprisingly that organizations with bigger budgets tended to apply management practices to a larger degree. Could be that bigger organizations might need more structure, that kind of stuff. But here's the question. Did organizations with larger budgets who applied management practices to a larger degree, did they have fewer challenges? The answer? No. Groups with larger budgets did not face less challenges than smaller groups. And this is a very, very important observation because more is not always better. And I think that this is a kind of a fallacy that those who oversee volunteer administration tend to think is, and maybe especially with smaller organizations, is we may feel like we're behind the curve and feel like we're doing a terrible job because we look at an organization that's bigger and maybe has more of their ducks in a row and is more structured and has all this stuff going on and all these very distinct job roles and everything is just nailed down tight. And we're like, we are doing a terrible job. And so we're doing bad. But the truth is that more is not always better. Just because an organization has more structure and more of things and more tight and more all this stuff, that does not mean that they have less challenges. So that is a very, very important observation. And in order to kind of take this a step further, is I want to share a model that came up that is from Jeff Brudney and Sync that came out in 2017. It's called the Ratchet model. And I love this so much. And so I'm actually very, very excited to share this with you guys. And I hope it's helpful. So the idea is that an organization and overseeing volunteers, you can kind of go one of two directions when you're leading volunteers. You can kind of go to a more tight direction where that's more rules, structure, everything is kind of nailed down, black and white. This is how we do things, that kind of stuff. Or you can go to a more loose model, which things are, again, there's less rules, less structure. It's a little bit more loose, that kind of stuff. Here below on this first slide, it kind of gives you a feeling for what a more loose or tight structure could feel like. So for example, when you're screening and selecting volunteers, if you're more loose, you might have a more minimal screening and selection. If you're tighter, you might have a lot more structure in who and how you're screening volunteers. Orientation can be loose, be minimal, brief orientation, or longer and more detailed orientation. And it's understanding that you can go either way. And the biggest takeaway, the most important thing that I want you to understand when it comes to this is that both ways are valid. And there could be things where you might have, even within your role, you might have places where it's better to be tight and places where it's better to be loose. And this just kind of goes back to understanding the big picture that more is not always better. And you have to figure out within your context, within your organization, within even some of the tasks that you're tasked with, is it better to have more, or maybe is it okay to be a little bit more loose? And in order to kind of just help you understand kind of the next step, this is the next part of the Ratchet model, is it kind of looks through some different places where an organization might choose that they need to be a little bit tighter or looser. For example, if you primarily work with episodic or one-off event type volunteers, you might lean towards being a little bit more loose, and that's okay. Where when you have those ongoing, daily, weekly, ongoing volunteers, that might require a little bit more structure than episodic type volunteers. If you're working with a vulnerable population, clearly you're probably going to need to lean to be a little bit more structured and a little bit more tight in how you manage volunteers because of the nature of who you're serving. A new organization. Some of you guys, if you are part of a new organization and your structure is just a little bit more loose and casual, understanding that that's probably appropriate and that's okay. You're not doing anything wrong. You're probably just doing the appropriate management style for where you are as an organization, where naturally over time, the more established an organization is, it might require eventually having more structure. Smaller organizations might tend to be a little bit more loose, where larger organizations might be more, structured. That's kind of the big picture there. Again, I love this model, and the big picture there, I hope everyone understands that. And I hope, honestly, this is something encouraging that you can take away from this, is understanding that more is not always better, and your specific context may dictate whether it is best for you to have a more structured or more loose management style of your volunteers. Something else I want to mention is kind of just a general observation. As we're kind of just moving towards the end here, I want to just kind of share some big picture observations besides more is not always better. And it's this: when I look at the most and least applied management practices, one thing I noticed is notice the two least applied management practices. The least applied management practice was training for paid staff and working with volunteers. The second least was training and professional development opportunities for volunteers. So when you put these least applied management practices, so not training paid staff to work with volunteers, whether that's because we assume everyone should just know how to do it, or what, we can figure out what that is. But does it begin to paint a picture if we're not training our staff to work with volunteers and not training and giving opportunities for volunteers to be trained, then do the challenges we face even make a little bit more sense? We're not training staff to work with volunteers, and then guess what? Those volunteers aren't continuing, and we don't have time to train staff to supervise or oversee volunteers. So then volunteers are quitting. So then we have to recruit volunteers. And that's kind of a really interesting thing for me, is there's this bigger story. We don't have time to train staff to work with volunteers. So then volunteers maybe are burning out and quitting, and then we have to recruit more. And it's saying that if we start with valuing having enough time to train people to work with volunteers and finding time to train our volunteers, could that be a really easy way to try to make sure we're keeping the volunteers we have, so we're not constantly needing to train and find and recruit more? And then just a few final observations here is recruiting tends to be a very top challenge in finding enough volunteers and the type of volunteers we need. Understanding that there are differences between groups. So that's one thing I do want you to also take, is understanding that the group that you are in, understand, like if you're working with environment or animals, understand that when you look at the group next door, and the challenges that they face may be different than the challenges that you face. So don't compare yourself to them and say, well, we are doing something wrong because our challenge is A, B, and C, when they're doing amazing at that. And it's understanding that that can be comparing apples to oranges, where the challenges that they face may be different than the challenges that you face. And it doesn't mean that you're doing a bad job. It might mean that the group that you are a part of has different types of challenges than the group that they're a part of. If anything, it would help find a similar type group to yours and kind of figure out what are they struggling with, and what are they doing, and what are they trying, and see what you can when you compare notes to them. That's going to be a most helpful way to figure out where you are compared to other groups. And just saying, more is not always better, and your context matters in how you lead volunteers. And so you have to figure out what is the best way for you to lead your volunteers in your context, and having more and more structure is not always the best answer. That's what we have going on.
Great. Thank you so much, David. This was amazing. It is a very important topic, and I am so glad that you were able to be with us to share your research with us. We did have a couple of questions that came through, but before we move to the questions, I just wanted to remind everyone, Gretchen put this in the chat, that the slides and the recording will be posted on the Alive members page. So if you're not a member yet, consider joining Alive. The cost is $50, and you'll get access to all of these really great webinars. And Gretchen will put that link in the chat. So a couple of questions did come up. Can you share the links to your research and report for the Brudney and Sink 2017 article?
Yeah. I have it here in the reference. Here are the references, and this is from Brudney and Sink, which is from here. It's a chapter in the Nonprofit Resource Management Handbook.
So that link will be in the slides for them.
It's in the reference, yeah.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And someone had asked, when you were talking about the budgets, small versus large, is that the budget for the organization or for the volunteer department?
For the organization. The question was, what was your yearly budget, under 50,000 up to over 5 million.
Perfect. And how many volunteer leaders were included in the study?
Well, 460 responses from volunteer administrators.
Okay, that's a lot. Okay, this is a multi-part question. Could you give us your thoughts or guess on how things have changed because of COVID? And would you consider doing a follow-up on this and how the numbers have changed from during COVID and now semi-post-COVID?
Yeah, that is obviously like all research before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. That's like 3 different worlds. So I definitely would love to do a follow-up, just asking these same exact questions now. I mean, and even that's what we're saying, even now we're kind of like in stage 2. There's like during COVID, there's like this weird not out of COVID. And now, I don't know, we're like in that next stage of like, okay, we're coming back into stuff. So a year from now, it's going to be totally different. But yeah, I definitely am interested in just doing the same exact study again and seeing where we are now. The thing is, what's interesting, so this study mirrors closely a study by Brudney and Hager that was done in 2004. And their responses, their results from a nationwide study were, interestingly enough, very close to my own results. And when you look at like top challenges and top management practices, the results were very, very similar. And so I think in some ways, I mean, of course, there wasn't a worldwide pandemic between 2004 and 2020. But at least it showed that when you look at, a national pandemic withstanding, that the challenges facing volunteer administrators is pretty consistent.
Great, thank you. Again, David, thank you so much for being with us today. It seems like quite a few people were interested in this topic. Again, we will be posting these slides. Please also know that you can continue the conversation with David if you think of a question after today's session, or if your question didn't get answered, or you just want some more information. Alive members can continue this discussion with David for the next 45 hours on LinkedIn, Alive members only page. So we hope to see you there. Gretchen will put that link in the chat. And then the next Alive Academy webinar is June 14th at 1 p.m. with Emily Bromett-Bauer and Jordania Reeves. They will be talking about using standards to make your case, introducing Alive standards for organizational volunteer engagement. We hope you can join us for that. And just to put a shout out there, we are always looking for volunteers at Alive. We always have open spaces, so make a difference in the field by joining us. We have committees. That's a wonderful way to build your own network while contributing to the national conversation about volunteer engagement. Right now, the programs, marketing, and membership committees are all looking for new members, so please reach out if you're interested in joining our work. Thank you again, David, for joining us. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Gretchen, for working on the back end. And we hope to see you at the next Alive Academy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Happy Friday.